Take your hands off her before you break her spine. Sharon's warning cut across the training yard as George tightened the support strap around Rebecca's waist. The physical therapist stood beside the wheelchair, furious that a stable hand had ignored her orders. Beyond the fence, employees from the Hawthorne estate watched in uneasy silence. Rebecca had not stood since the riding accident 4 years earlier. Her father had spent millions on specialists, machines, and private clinics. Nothing had returned movement to her legs. George had only asked for 10 minutes with Atlas, the calm black horse Rebecca used to ride as a teenager. "You clean stalls," Sharon said. "You are not a doctor." "No," George answered, "but I know this horse, and he knows her." Rebecca placed both hands on the saddle. Her arms trembled as George lifted her carefully from the chair. Sharon stepped forward, but Rebecca stopped her. "I asked him to do this." George settled Rebecca onto Atlas and secured her legs with padded supports. The horse remained perfectly still until Rebecca touched his neck. "Walk," she whispered. Atlas took one slow step, then another. Rebecca's shoulders rose. Her frightened grip loosened. George walked beside her, one hand near the saddle but never touching it. When Atlas crossed the center of the yard, Rebecca lifted her face toward the sunlight. A black limousine had stopped beside the stable. Edward Hawthorne stood near the open door, still wearing the suit from his morning meeting. He stared at his daughter moving across the yard on horseback. His briefcase slipped from his hand. Rebecca saw him and smiled. "Dad," she called, "look at me." Edward covered his mouth, but the sound escaped anyway. A broken sob from a man who had forgotten how to hope. Sharon rushed toward the horse. "This is reckless. Get her down immediately." Edward wiped his eyes and raised one trembling hand. "No," he said. "Nobody touches her." Then he turned toward George. "You are not leaving this estate until you tell me how you did what every expert said was impossible." Before the story goes any further, take a second to subscribe and comment where you're watching from. Stories like this travel farther when viewers become part of them. Now, while Edward Hawthorne still stood frozen in the yard, George kept one steady hand near Atlas and waited to see who would speak first. George kept his eyes on Atlas, not Edward. "Sir, I didn't make anything impossible happen," he said. "Your daughter already knew how to ride. I only gave her a safe way to remember." Sharon folded her arms. "Rebecca has no functional control below the waist. One shift in the saddle could throw her." George nodded toward Atlas's slow, even steps. "That's why I chose him, used a double support strap, shortened the reins, and kept him inside the soft ring. I spent 3 weeks teaching him to stop whenever Rebecca's balance changed." Edward stared at him. "3 weeks?" Rebecca answered first. "I asked him to help me." Atlas completed another careful circle. Rebecca's breathing had steadied, but sweat shone along her temples. George lifted 2 fingers. The horse stopped at once. "Rest," he told her. "I'm not tired." "You're exhausted." Annoyance crossed her face, yet she lowered her hands to the saddle horn. It was the first time Edward had seen anyone contradict his daughter without pitying her or surrendering to her anger. George turned to Sharon. "Check the strap near her left hip. It may be pressing too hard." Sharon hesitated, then approached. Her anger weakened when she saw the padding, emergency release, and reinforced saddle George had altered by hand. Nothing about it was careless. "Where did you learn this?" she asked. "My younger brother had a spinal injury," George said. "He rode during rehabilitation. I helped at the center for 6 years." Edward stepped closer. "You never mentioned that when Jason hired you." "Jason hired me to manage your horses, not discuss my family." At the estate manager's name, Edward's expression tightened. Jason had repeatedly insisted Rebecca remain away from the stable because the insurance risk was too high. He had even ordered Atlas sold 2 months earlier. Rebecca looked down at her father. George stopped the sale. I delayed it, George corrected. Atlas refused 2 buyers. He became aggressive whenever anyone tried to load him, but calmed down when Rebecca's old blanket was near the stall. Rebecca ran her fingers through his mane. He remembered me. So you made this plan behind my back, Edward said. I made it behind Jason's back, Rebecca replied. I tried to tell you twice. Both times he said you were unavailable. Edward's jaw tightened, but George interrupted. She needs to come down now. Rebecca's smile vanished. One more circle. No. I waited 4 years for this. And if you push until your arms fail, your first ride ends with fear instead of victory. The words hurt because they were true. After several seconds, she nodded. George guided Atlas beside the mounting platform. With Sharon supporting Rebecca's shoulders and George controlling her hips, they transferred her safely into the wheelchair. The instant her body touched the seat, her hands began to shake. Edward dropped to one knee before her. Did it hurt? Yes, Rebecca admitted. Then she smiled through tears. But not where you think. She touched her chest. Edward took her hand, unable to answer. Behind them, a golf cart stopped at the stable gate. Jason stepped out carrying a folder stamped with the estate's legal seal. What happened here? He demanded. His gaze moved from the modified saddle to Rebecca's flushed face. Then he opened the folder. George, he said, you were warned never to place her on a horse. Effective immediately, you're dismissed. Edward rose slowly, still holding Rebecca's hand. On whose authority? He asked. Jason did not flinch. On the authority you gave me when you made me responsible for this estate. George violated a safety order, modified equipment without approval, and exposed Rebecca to serious injury. She asked him to help her, Edward said. That does not make it legal. Rebecca wheeled herself between them. Stop talking about me as if I'm not here. Jason's expression softened in the practiced way it always did around her. I'm trying to protect you. No, you're trying to control what happens around me because control makes you comfortable. George removed his gloves and placed them on the fence. He had expected anger, but not dismissal. The job paid for the apartment where his 16-year-old son, Ryan, lived with him every other week. It also covered the trade program Ryan had entered after struggling in school. Missing even 1 month of tuition could cost his son the place. Still, George forced his voice to remain calm. Mr. Hawthorne, Jason is right about one thing. I broke the order. Rebecca understood the risks, but the decision was mine too. Edward studied him. Why risk your livelihood for someone you barely know? George looked toward Atlas. Because I knew what it was like to watch a person disappear while everyone called it protection. He had promised himself he would not speak about Jeffrey here, but Rebecca deserved the truth. His younger brother had been 22 when a construction accident damaged his spine. Their parents removed every sharp corner, canceled every outing, and answered every question for him. They believed they were keeping Jeffrey safe. Within a year, he had stopped asking to leave the house. A riding therapist named Kathleen finally convinced him to try a horse. Jeffrey did not regain the use of his legs, but he regained the habit of making choices. He returned to college, learned to drive with hand controls, and later became a counselor at the rehabilitation center. Jeffrey died 3 years ago from an infection unrelated to his injury, George said. But before that, he lived. There's a difference. Rebecca's eyes lowered to her motionless legs. Everyone keeps promising another treatment. Nobody asks what I want to do while we wait. Edward's face tightened. He had paid every expert because money was the only language in which he never felt helpless. He had measured love in appointments, equipment, and guarded hallways. Hearing Rebecca speak made those efforts feel less like devotion and more like walls. I thought giving you the best care meant giving you the best chance, he said. The best chance at what? She asked. Walking someday. What about today? The question landed harder than any accusation. Jason closed the folder. This is emotional, but the risk remains. One fall could trigger a lawsuit, destroy the estate's insurance coverage, and endanger every employee. George knew that. George glanced at the dismissal notice. He could defend the saddle, the horse, and the training. He could not deny the secrecy. "Give me until 5, he said. "Let Sharon examine everything I built. Let her decide whether it was reckless. After that, if you still want me gone, I'll leave without argument." Jason shook his head. "No." But Edward took the folder from his hand. "At 5, he said. Rebecca tightened her grip on the wheels of her chair. "And if the setup is safe," she said, "I ride again tomorrow." By 4:30, Sharon had inspected every buckle, seam, and release point on the modified saddle. George stood nearby while she tested the supports with weighted bags, then made Atlas walk, stop, and turn through the ring. Jason watched from the doorway with a phone pressed to his ear. When Sharon finished, she faced Edward. "The workmanship is solid," she said. "The horse is unusually responsive, and George planned for the obvious risks. But this is not a medical program. Rebecca's fatigue, skin pressure, and balance must be monitored. She cannot ride whenever she wants." Rebecca's disappointment showed immediately. George should have felt relieved. Instead, he said, "Then let me build the program properly." Jason ended his call. "Your employment ends tonight." George spoke to Edward. "Give me 30 days. Sharon sets the medical limits. I handle Atlas and the equipment. Rebecca follows every safety rule, even when she hates it." "And after 30 days?" Edward asked. "We decide whether riding improves her strength, confidence, and independence enough to continue." Jason stepped forward. "You cannot authorize this based on one emotional afternoon." Edward kept his eyes on George. "What would you need?" "A safer mounting platform, pressure sensors in the saddle pad, and 2 trained assistants. Rebecca must also have the right to stop whenever she chooses." Rebecca gave a bitter laugh. "Permission to decide what happens to my own body?" "Yes." Jason opened the folder. George signed a conduct agreement. Unauthorized use of estate property is grounds for dismissal and forfeiture of staff housing. George felt the room narrow. Staff housing was not merely his home. Ryan had finally settled into a school where he was no longer treated like a problem. Losing the apartment meant moving across the county, abandoning the trade program, and breaking the routine they had rebuilt after years of conflict. Edward turned to him. "Is that true?" "Yes." "Why didn't you mention it?" "Because Rebecca's ride should not become leverage for saving my job." Jason set a pen on the folder. "Sign, leave tonight, and we end this quietly." George stared at the acknowledgement line. He imagined Ryan's anger, the boxes, the unpaid bills, and his son accusing him of choosing someone else's crisis over his own family again. Then Rebecca asked, "If he leaves, Atlas leaves too, doesn't he?" Jason's silence answered her. George looked at Edward. "Was the sale canceled?" "Delayed." Jason's expression hardened. Keeping an unusable horse costs money and creates liability. Atlas lowered his head against Rebecca's shoulder. George understood that taking the quiet exit would erase the one choice Rebecca had made for herself. He pushed the form back. "I won't sign a statement calling the ride misconduct," he said. "I'll accept suspension and lose the housing. I'll also submit every modification and training record. But I won't help you pretend Atlas is useless." Jason's confidence returned. "Then you leave by sunset." Edward opened his mouth, but George stopped him. "No special rescue. If this program deserves to exist, it must survive more than one rich man's emotion." Jason picked up the folder, satisfied. Edward took it from him and tore the dismissal page in half. "George may be suspended," he said, "but Atlas is not being sold." Jason's satisfaction vanished. Edward handed George the remaining papers. 30 days, he said. "Tomorrow, we begin by finding out why Rebecca's requests never reached me." The next morning, George returned to the stable wearing ordinary clothes instead of his estate uniform. Suspension meant he could not perform paid work, so Sharon insisted that every task be documented as part of Rebecca's evaluation. Edward arrived before sunrise. That alone surprised Rebecca. Her father usually sent assistants to early appointments, then appeared later with questions already prepared by someone else. Now he carried coffee in a paper cup and stood beside the mounting platform while George checked Atlas's breathing. Jason watched from outside the ring. 10 minutes, Sharon said. No more. I want her pulse checked before and after, and we stop at the first sign of skin pressure or loss of balance. Rebecca nodded. Understood. George crouched beside her wheelchair. Yesterday, Atlas carried you. Today, you helped direct him. My legs can't cue him. Your hands can. Your shoulders can. Your voice can. Riding isn't one movement. He handed her shortened reins with soft loops that would not slip from her fingers. Rebecca guided Atlas to the rail, asked him to walk, then practiced stopping at 3 marked points. The first stop came late. The second was crooked. On the third, Atlas halted exactly beside a blue cone. Rebecca laughed, a quick, startled sound that made Edward turn away and press his fist against his mouth. George pretended not to notice. Again. By the 8th minute, Rebecca was no longer waiting for George to correct her. She adjusted the reins, lifted her chest, and gave Atlas the command herself. The horse turned through the center of the ring. Sharon checked her watch. Time. Rebecca started to protest, then saw George's expression and stopped. Fine, she said. But tomorrow I get 12 minutes. Tomorrow you earn 12. After they transferred her into the chair, Sharon tested the sensation along Rebecca's hips and examined the pressure points. There was mild redness, but nothing dangerous. Her pulse recovered faster than it had the previous day. Sharon wrote the results on her chart. This is not proof that riding will change her diagnosis, she said. Edward's hope dimmed slightly. But it may improve trunk control, circulation, endurance, and confidence. More importantly, she followed instructions and tolerated the session. Rebecca leaned back, exhausted and radiant. That sounds like proof of something. Sharon allowed herself a smile. It does. Edward stepped toward George. You gave her something no clinic has managed to give her in 4 years. No, George said. She took it. That matters. Edward glanced at his daughter, then at the stable employees gathered near the gate. The 30-day program continues. George's suspension is lifted. Jason's head snapped toward him. Edward, we have not reviewed the liability waiver. Then review it today. George should have felt victorious. Instead, he remembered the agreement Jason had cited. What about the housing clause? He asked. Edward answered without hesitation. You and Ryan remain. For the first time that morning, George smiled. At that exact moment, Atlas shifted sharply beneath the empty saddle and pinned his ears toward the storage room. George followed the horse's gaze. The door stood open. Inside, the old adaptive saddle was missing. Jason closed his folder. Before anyone accuses me, I ordered it removed for inspection. No equipment will be used again until its ownership and alterations are verified. Rebecca's joy vanished. George looked at the bare hook on the wall and understood the cost of their victory. They had won permission to continue. Now they had no saddle with which to do it. The missing saddle turned the stable's celebration into an argument. Edward wanted a replacement flown in that afternoon. Sharon explained that an adaptive saddle could not be purchased like office furniture. It had to match Rebecca's body, Atlas's back, and the way her balance shifted. The wrong support could create pressure injuries before she felt anything was wrong. Then we wait, Sharon said. Rebecca stared at the empty hook. I have spent 4 years waiting. George understood her anger too well. That was why he made the mistake. I can build another one in 2 days, he said. Sharon turned toward him. You built the first over 3 weeks. I already know the measurements. You also had time to test each change. Jason, standing near the door, gave a small nod. This is exactly the problem. He hears no and turns it into a personal challenge. George ignored him. 48 hours. Rebecca's hope returned so quickly that George could not take the promise back. He worked through the day in the repair shed, shaping a lighter support frame around a standard saddle. Ryan joined him after school, still wearing the work boots from his training program. For an hour, father and son measured foam, checked straps, and argued over the angle of the hip brace. At 7, Ryan set down the drill. You missed my evaluation. George looked at the clock. The meeting with Ryan's instructor had started 2 hours earlier. I'm sorry. I lost track. You always lose track when somebody needs saving. That isn't fair. Ryan laughed without humor. You risked our home without telling me. Now you forgot the meeting that decides whether I stay in the program. George's first instinct was to defend himself. Ryan had skipped classes last year, lied about assignments, and nearly lost the placement on his own. The words were already forming when he saw his son's hands shaking. Did they remove you? I don't know. The instructor said he wanted both of us there. George reached for his phone, but Ryan stepped back. Uncle Jeffrey used to say you couldn't stand being helpless. I thought he meant you were brave. George stopped. Ryan looked at the half-built saddle. Maybe he meant you make promises because you can't accept that some things take time. The shed door opened. Sharon entered, examined the frame, and pressed her thumb into the new padding. This cannot be used tomorrow, she said. The right side compresses unevenly. I can correct it tonight. No, you are tired, and tired people miss dangerous details. George's frustration broke through. Rebecca finally has something she wants. Every delay teaches her that Jason was right to keep her away. No, Sharon said. Every reckless shortcut teaches her that independence means ignoring limits. Rebecca had followed her inside. She heard every word. Her gaze settled on the unfinished saddle, then on George. Was yesterday safe because you prepared carefully, or because we were lucky? George could not answer quickly enough. Jason closed the door behind her. The insurer has now suspended all riding activity until the original saddle is returned, and the program receives written approval. That could take several weeks. Rebecca wheeled away without speaking. George stood beside the workbench, surrounded by tools he had trusted more than patience. Ryan picked up his backpack. Before leaving, he paused at the doorway. There's something else Uncle Jeffrey told me about the last horse you trained for him, he said. Something you never told Rebecca. Ryan did not leave immediately. He stood in the doorway, gripping one strap of his backpack. Uncle Jeffrey said you once put him on a horse before Kathleen approved it, he said. He fell. Rebecca turned her wheelchair back toward George. Sharon's expression sharpened. Is that true? George stared at the unfinished saddle. The memory had lived inside him for 13 years, stripped of every detail that made him look reckless. Jeffrey had been recovering for only 6 months. He was angry, ashamed, and desperate to prove that the accident had not taken everything from him. Kathleen had told them to wait until a safer saddle arrived. George had believed waiting would destroy his brother's courage. He borrowed equipment from another rider and promised Jeffrey he would remain beside him. During a turn, the support shifted. Jeffrey fell and fractured his wrist. He did not ride again for nearly a year. Yes, George admitted. I pushed him too soon. Rebecca's voice became quiet. And you let me believe you always knew exactly what you were doing. I knew Atlas. I knew the first saddle. But today I promised a replacement before I knew I could make one safely. Ryan lowered his eyes. He had wanted his father to admit it, but hearing the confession gave him no satisfaction. Jason opened his folder and removed several photographs. This is why I took the original saddle, he said. He placed the photographs on the workbench. One showed a narrow split near the metal support beneath the right hip pad. Another showed stress around a bolt George had added. The inspector found a developing crack, Jason continued. It may have held for several more rides. It may not have. Rebecca went pale. George lifted the photograph, recognizing the weld immediately. He had checked the straps and padding before her ride, but not the hidden joint beneath the frame. Edward stepped toward Jason. "Why didn't you tell us?" "Because I requested the inspection before yesterday's ride, after I discovered George had modified estate equipment. He used it before the inspector arrived." "You could have warned me," George said. "I ordered you not to use it at all." The answer struck harder because it was true. Jason had controlled Rebecca's access and hidden her requests from Edward, but George had converted every restriction into proof that only he understood her. In doing so, he had ignored the difference between courage and haste. Rebecca looked at Atlas through the open door. "Was I in danger?" George could have softened the truth. He did not. "Yes." Edward's hand closed around the edge of the workbench. "You told me the equipment was safe. I believed it was. Belief was not enough." Rebecca's eyes filled, though her voice remained steady. "You were the first person in 4 years who treated me like I could choose. But you also decided what risks I was allowed to understand." George had no defense against that. Sharon gathered the photographs. The program is not dead, but it cannot belong to George, Jason, or Edward. It must belong to Rebecca, with honest information and shared responsibility. Jason objected. "The insurer has already stopped it." "Then we use the next few weeks to build something they can approve," Sharon replied. "No secret rides, no rushed saddle, no decisions made around Rebecca." Edward faced his daughter. "What do you want?" Rebecca looked first at George, then at the damaged saddle. "I still want to ride," she said, "but I don't want anyone saving me anymore." Her gaze settled on George. "If you stay, you don't lead this alone. You help me learn enough to challenge you when you're wrong." George felt the purpose of the entire fight change. He had thought his job was to put Rebecca back on a horse. Now he understood that his real job was to make sure she no longer needed his permission. The riding ring stayed empty for 6 days. Rebecca spent those mornings in the workshop beside Sharon while George explained every part of the new saddle. He showed her how pressure moved through the frame, why one strap could stabilize her without trapping her, and how a support that felt comfortable for 5 minutes could become dangerous after 20. At first, George caught himself speaking only to Sharon. Rebecca noticed. "Ask me," she said when he discussed the hip brace. George paused. "Do you feel more secure when the support sits higher or lower?" "Lower. Higher makes me feel pinned." Sharon marked the change. George adjusted the design. It was a small correction, but Rebecca's posture changed. She was no longer the patient waiting to be handled. She was part of the work. Edward joined them whenever he could. He took calls outside instead of leaving entirely. He learned how to check the emergency release and recognize the redness that meant Rebecca needed to stop. Each lesson exposed how little he had known about her daily life. Jason rarely entered the workshop. He sent emails, requested signatures, and warned that the insurer could still reject the program. His objections were supported by policy instead of authority, which made them harder to dismiss. On the 7th afternoon, he arrived with the insurer's requirements. "They will consider approval," he said, "if a certified adaptive riding specialist supervises the first 3 sessions, the saddle passes an independent inspection, and Rebecca completes a medical review." Rebecca scanned the pages. "How long?" 3 weeks at best." Her hands tightened on the paper. George waited for her to explode. Instead, she asked, "Can we train without mounting?" Sharon nodded. "Transfers, reins, balance work, emergency procedures. Then we start now." Jason looked surprised. He had expected impatience to defeat her faster than any regulation. The next days became harder than riding. Rebecca practiced moving from her chair to a padded bench until her arms burned. She learned to release a strap with one hand. She trained Atlas from the ground, guiding him through voice commands while George stood several feet away. One afternoon, Atlas ignored her request to stop and continued toward the gate. George stepped forward automatically. Rebecca raised her palm. "Don't!" She reset her shoulders, shortened one rein, and gave the command again. Atlas stopped. The victory was quiet. No employees gathered. Rebecca simply exhaled and touched the horse's neck. That evening, George drove Ryan to the training center for the rescheduled evaluation. He apologized before they entered. "I made your life unstable because I decided my intentions mattered more than the risk," he said. "That was wrong." Ryan studied him. "Are you going to do it again?" "I might make another mistake, but not that one." Inside, Ryan's instructor kept him in the program, provided he completed 2 missed assignments. George did not argue. Ryan accepted the condition himself. When they returned to the estate, Edward was waiting near the stable with Rebecca. The saddle had passed inspection. But Jason held another document. "The specialist has agreed to come," he said. "There is one condition. George cannot participate in Rebecca's first approved ride." Rebecca stared at him. "Why?" "The insurer considers his presence an unacceptable influence after the unauthorized session." George felt the words like a door closing. Rebecca turned to him, waiting for anger. This time, he did not challenge the rule. "If the ride is truly yours," he said, "then it has to succeed even when I'm not beside you." The night before the approved ride, Edward found Jason alone in the stable office. "You kept Rebecca's request from me," Edward said. "I need to know why." Jason closed the ledger. "Because 4 years ago, after the accident, you told me never to let her near another horse. I was terrified. You were also clear." Edward remembered the hospital corridor, Rebecca behind closed doors, and his own hands covered with dust from the arena. He had told Jason to remove every saddle from her sight, cancel every riding appointment, and stop anyone from giving her false hope. Later, when Rebecca asked about Atlas, Jason had followed the one order Edward had never withdrawn. "You could have told me she kept asking," Edward said. "You stopped taking my calls whenever the subject was horses. Then you made me responsible for keeping the estate safe." Jason's voice remained controlled, but the fear beneath it was finally visible. "I watched them lift her from that arena. I watched you promise nothing like it would happen again. So I believed stopping her was loyalty." Edward sat across from him. For years he had treated Jason's control as arrogance, because that explanation required less courage than admitting Jason had learned it from him. Rebecca had been listening from the doorway. "The accident wasn't Atlas's fault," she said. Both men turned. She wheeled inside and placed her hands flat on the desk. "It wasn't even the jump's fault. I saw Dad arrive at the competition after missing my previous 3 events. I wanted him to see me win, so I ignored my coach and took the higher fence." Edward's breathing changed. Rebecca had never told him that. She had called it a bad landing, and he had never asked for more because the medical facts were easier to survive than the emotional ones. "I pushed too hard because I wanted your attention," she continued. "Then after I was hurt, you gave me all of it, but only as fear." Edward lowered his head. "I thought if I controlled every risk, I could undo what happened." "You couldn't undo it," Rebecca said. "You only made the accident the last decision I was allowed to make." Jason looked toward the window. "And I helped?" "Yes," she replied. "You did." No one offered him forgiveness to make the moment easier. Rebecca turned to her father. "Tomorrow, I don't want you beside the mounting platform." Edward looked up sharply. "I want you there, but in the stands. You don't give instructions. You don't stop the session because you're afraid. Sharon decides medical safety. The specialist controls the ride. I decide whether I continue." "And George?" Edward asked. "He stays outside the ring, as required." George had entered quietly behind her. The condition still hurt, but he understood it differently now. Being excluded was a test of whether he had taught Rebecca independence or merely replaced one controller with another. Rebecca faced Jason last. "You will send every message concerning me directly to me, not only to my father." Jason nodded. "I will. And Atlas is not property to be sold without my knowledge." "That decision belongs to Edward," Edward answered first. "Not anymore. Atlas belongs to you." Rebecca's eyes filled, but she did not look away. The next morning's ride was no longer about proving George right or Jason wrong. It would be the first time everyone around Rebecca had agreed to let her own both the hope and the risk. The approved session began with more silence than Rebecca expected. The certified specialist, Laura Bennett, checked every strap twice, then asked Rebecca to explain the emergency release in her own words. Sharon recorded her pulse. Edward sat alone in the small viewing stand, exactly where Rebecca had told him to remain. Jason stood near the gate with the insurer's paperwork tucked beneath one arm. George waited outside the ring. Rebecca hated how much she noticed his absence. The transfer went smoothly. The new saddle held her evenly, and Atlas responded to her voice before Laura touched the lead line. For the first several minutes, Rebecca walked the rail, stopped at the blue cones, and turned through the center. Then Laura asked for a wide circle at the far end of the arena. It was the same end where Rebecca had fallen 4 years earlier. Nothing remained from that day. The broken rail had been replaced. The dirt was level. There was no jump, no crowd, and no reason for Atlas to fear the space. Rebecca's body remembered anyway. Her fingers tightened around the reins. Her chest collapsed forward. Atlas slowed, sensing the change, but Rebecca could no longer hear Laura's instructions clearly. The arena seemed to narrow until all she could see was the patch of ground where she had once opened her eyes and realized her legs would not move. "Rebecca, breathe," Sharon called. Edward rose from his seat, then forced himself to remain there. Laura asked Atlas to stop. Rebecca tried to give the command herself, but no sound came. The horse took one more step. "Get me down," she whispered. Laura leaned closer. "Do you want to pause or end the session?" "End it. Now." The emergency team moved calmly. There was no fall, no equipment failure, and no injury. Still, when Rebecca returned to her wheelchair, she could not lift her eyes from her hands. The session had lasted 7 minutes. Jason spoke quietly with Laura while Sharon checked Rebecca's skin and blood pressure. No one congratulated her. No one knew what to call what had happened. To Rebecca, it felt like losing the future only days after she had finally believed it might belong to her. Edward approached only after Rebecca nodded permission. "I'm sorry," he said. She looked up, wounded by the word. "For what?" "For all the years I made that end of the arena powerful enough to own you." Rebecca's lips trembled. "You didn't do this." "I did. I thought I was ready because George made one ride feel easy." George remained beyond the gate, obeying the restriction, even though every instinct told him to enter. Rebecca finally faced him. "I can't do it without you," she said. "And that means I'm not independent at all." The statement struck George harder than losing the job had. He had wanted to return something to her. Instead, she believed her courage belonged to him. Laura closed her evaluation folder. "The insurer will not approve another mounted session this week." Rebecca turned away. George watched Atlas lower his head toward the blue cone where she had stopped him perfectly days earlier. Then he understood the possibility everyone else had missed. "You ended the ride before fear made the decision for you," he said from outside the ring. 4 years ago, you ignored the warning inside you. Today, you listened. Rebecca did not answer, but her hand stopped shaking. That evening, Rebecca asked George to meet her in the stable after everyone had gone. Atlas stood in his stall. The new saddle rested beside the mounting platform, where Rebecca had already positioned her chair. "No insurer," she said. "No specialist, just one circle. You walk beside me like the first time." George felt the temptation immediately. One quiet ride might restore her confidence. He could keep a hand near the saddle, control Atlas, and prove the failed session had been nothing more than fear. It would also repeat every mistake that had brought them there. "No," he said. Rebecca's expression hardened. "You did it when I didn't understand the risk. Now I understand. And you refuse. Because I understand it too. You told me riding was my choice. It is. But asking me to hide it makes it our secret again, not your freedom." She turned away. "Then maybe Jason was right about you." The accusation hurt, because part of it was deserved. "Maybe he was right about the part of me that needs to be the person who makes things possible," George said. Rebecca stopped. "If I put you on Atlas tonight, you may ride one circle. Tomorrow, the insurer ends the program, Sharon loses authority, and every decision returns to your father and Jason. You gain 10 minutes and lose the chance to ride for years." "What am I supposed to do? Wait until I'm not afraid?" "No. Choose what you do while you're afraid." The next morning, George asked Laura, Sharon, Edward, and Jason to meet in the ring. Ryan came too, carrying the blue cones from Rebecca's first session. George placed one at the entrance, one at the center, and the last at the far end where she had frozen. "I want a second evaluation," he said, "when Laura believes Rebecca is physically ready." Jason shook his head. "The insurer refused another session this week. I'm not asking anyone to ignore them." George handed Laura a training plan. Rebecca would practice the route from her wheelchair, then from the mounting platform, then on Atlas while stationary. Only after she could direct every stop would she attempt the far circle. "And your role?" Laura asked. "None inside the ring." Rebecca stared at him. "If my presence is what makes her believe she can ride, then I taught dependence. I'll prepare Atlas and answer questions. During the evaluation, I stay beyond the gate." Edward frowned. "You could lose your place in the program." "I know." The estate offered George housing, purpose, and stability for Ryan. Stepping away could make him unnecessary, but remaining indispensable would steal the independence he claimed to defend. Rebecca studied the cones. "What if I reach the far end and panic again?" George did not offer rescue. "You decide whether to stop, turn back, or continue. Any of those can be your choice." Laura read the plan twice. "I'll submit it today." Jason removed the old dismissal form from his folder and tore it across the signature line. "I owe you an apology," he told Rebecca. "I called control protection because admitting my fear would have cost me authority. From now on, your messages come to you first." The apology did not erase 4 years, but it cost him the power he had guarded. 3 days later, the insurer approved one final evaluation. As Rebecca approached the mounting platform, George opened the gate. Then, instead of following her inside, he stepped back. The final evaluation began at 9 on Saturday morning. Laura checked the saddle. Sharon checked Rebecca's skin, pulse, and blood pressure. Jason signed the insurer's form and handed the clipboard directly to Rebecca. Edward sat in the viewing stand without his phone. Ryan placed the 3 blue cones where Rebecca had practiced, then joined George outside the gate. Atlas waited beside the mounting platform. Rebecca rolled forward. Her hands stayed steady until Laura secured the final strap. Then she glanced toward the far end of the arena, and pressure tightened across her chest. George saw it beyond the fence. He did not call her name or offer reassurance. He placed both hands on the rail and waited. The choice remained hers. "Ready?" Laura asked. "Yes." Atlas stepped into the ring. At the first cone, Rebecca gave the stopping command. Atlas halted cleanly. At the second, she turned him through the center with her voice, shoulders, and shortened reins. Laura walked several feet away, holding the lead loosely enough that the horse followed Rebecca. The far cone waited near the place where everything had changed 4 years earlier. Rebecca's breathing shortened. Edward rose halfway from his seat, then forced himself down again. At the edge of the circle, Rebecca's arms began to shake. "Stop," she said. Atlas stopped. Laura remained still. "What do you choose?" Rebecca stared at the dirt. The old version of courage had meant pushing harder and ignoring fear until someone praised her. That was how she had been injured. George had nearly repeated the same mistake by treating every limit as an enemy. "I need 60 seconds, Rebecca said. Laura nodded. No one rushed her. Sharon watched the time. Jason kept the gate closed. Edward stayed seated. George remained outside. Rebecca loosened one hand and pressed it against Atlas's neck. Her legs still did not move. Her future still contained pain, work, uncertainty, and a wheelchair. The first ride had not changed those facts, but the horse beneath her was real. So was the decision in front of her. "Turn left," Rebecca said. Atlas moved away from the frightening patch of ground. Edward's shoulders dropped. He thought she was retreating. Then Rebecca guided Atlas into a smaller circle, returned to the cone from another angle, and stopped again. George smiled. She was not repeating the old route because someone else had drawn it. She was finding her own. "Walk." Atlas crossed the far end of the arena. A broken laugh escaped Edward. He covered his mouth as he had on the first day, but now he did not cry because he believed his daughter had been restored to who she was before the accident. He cried because she had become someone he had never allowed himself to see. Rebecca completed the circle and turned toward the center. Laura released the lead line. For 20 yards, Atlas carried Rebecca under her direction alone. At the final cone, she stopped him and looked toward George. "I did it without you," she called. His throat tightened. "Yes, you did." Rebecca smiled. "But not because you left." George understood. Independence did not mean needing no one. It meant help no longer erased ownership of her life. Rebecca chose when the session ended. Laura and Sharon transferred her safely to the wheelchair. Her arms were exhausted, and a pressure check showed enough redness to require 2 days of rest. This time, she did not argue. Laura signed the evaluation. "The program is approved," she said, with medical limits, scheduled reviews, and Rebecca's consent at every stage. Edward came down from the stands and stopped before his daughter. "May I hug you?" Rebecca nodded. He knelt and held her, shaking. "I spent 4 years making sure I never saw you fall again," he said. "I didn't understand that I was refusing to see you rise." "Then watch now," Rebecca whispered. Jason approached George after the others moved toward the stable. "I recommended your dismissal," he said. "Some reasons were valid. The way I used them was not. I'm stepping away from decisions about Rebecca's care. I'll remain estate manager only if Rebecca and Edward believe I can do that job without controlling hers." It was not ruin or public humiliation. It was a consequence he could not escape with paperwork. He would have to earn trust without authority. George offered his hand. "Start by listening before you protect." Jason shook it. Later, Ryan examined the cracked original saddle. George had planned to discard it. "Keep the blue padding," Ryan said, "not the broken metal." Together, they removed one safe blue strap and mounted it on the workshop wall. It would never carry Rebecca again. Its meaning had changed from secret rescue to the first imperfect step toward honest freedom. 3 months later, Rebecca rode Atlas twice a week. She did not walk again, and no one called her progress a miracle. She began driving with hand controls, returned to the estate office part-time, and required every meeting concerning her to include her from the beginning. George became director of her small adaptive riding program, with Sharon holding equal authority to stop any session. Ryan completed his trade program and helped design a lighter mounting rail. George attended every evaluation. Jason remained at the estate. Trust returned slowly, measured by how often he asked Rebecca what she wanted before offering a solution. One autumn morning, Edward stood by the fence as Atlas carried Rebecca toward the far end of the arena. George repaired a gate. Sharon watched from the platform. Ryan adjusted a blue cone. Rebecca reached the place where she had once fallen. She stopped, breathed, and chose her own path across it. Edward's eyes filled again. This time, Rebecca did not need to call. "Look at me." Her father had finally learned how.